Was Passion 2024 with a song called Bless God. You're on Rhema 94.9. It's 20 minutes past 4. It's Tuesday afternoon and it's time for Creation Ministries International. And this afternoon we are blessed to have Dr. Ron Neller on the line. He is he was an associate professor in things like fluvial geomorphology. Did I get the words right?
Yes, Mick. Pluvial geomorphology.
Good afternoon, Dr. Ron.
It's a big word. Good afternoon, Mick. How are you?
Oh, good. Thank you. Look, it's a very hard word to get, fluvial geomorphology. And basically what it means, you understand how the earth changes when it rains or when it floods. And, of course, reading through your history, which I always have a bit of a giggle when I look at it, you said that you've been to church a few times in your life, but it wasn't until you were sort of in your 50s you decided, okay, that's it, I'm going to become a Christian. And then all of a sudden, all the stuff that you'd learnt at university, you'd been an associate professor, all of a sudden it all just fell into place. And it was like one of those aha moments.
It was indeed. It was indeed. In fact, if you don't want to use that term, pluvial geomorphologist, just call me a flood chaser, because that's what I did worldwide, looking at landforms, looking at floods, trying to explain the landforms today by the floods of today, and it just doesn't work. Something happened in the past that was catastrophic.
You've sort of told us a bit about, some of the things that have happened. We've talked in the past about, what the ground looks like and why it looks more like there has been a flood. And, of course, you say everything fell into place. But there's this thing called a Carnian Pluvial episode or a Carnian Pluvial event that, many fluvial geomorphologists, I have to say that it makes me sound smarter, they talk about this. You don't so much. Can you tell us what it is?
Well, it sounds mysterious, doesn't it? That sort of terminology, Carnian Pluvial event. Well, I thought, let's unpack it. The Carnian refers to basically a slice of time, if you like, about 232 million years ago, back in what they call the sort of late Triassic period in the Mesozoic. That's when all things changed, they say, when dinosaurs came along after that and all the rest of it. And pluvial is simply a word that means, if you want to keep it simple, it means rainy. It really means wet periods or a super wet spell. And so they argue that for about 2 million years, you had this Carnian pluvial episode when it was absolutely pouring down. Not every day and not, all around the world at once, but it was certainly impacting the world. It was certainly having an incredible impact, even though it was stop and start. And essentially what they say is that these floods that occurred at that time, these floods left their mark on the rocks and the landscapes and so on. But they put it at 232 million years ago. And it's just an interesting argument that this happened then. They actually use the same features to argue that this happened 232 million years ago that were the same features that I looked at in my 35 years of world travel that pointed to a recent global flood equivalent to Noah's flood and hence brought me to Christ.
Yeah.
So it's a much earlier, they claim it happened, this wet period happened millions and hundreds of millions of years earlier, using the same line of evidence that I would use today to say that, no, that's not quite the case. And I tell you, sorry?
Yep.
No, I was going to say it's become very, let's just say very popular these days. And it's, hard to ignore this concept, the Carnian Pluvial event. And they link it to, at that time, global warming, volcanic eruptions, mass extinctions of particularly marine animals and so on. And so what you've got there really is a blockbuster scientific story. It's really exciting if you want to make a movie out of that. But I think we need to remember no one saw it happen. It's all interpretation. And, I think you'll be very careful here to say that worldview does not affect the way you look at things. These people who believe the earth is hundreds of millions of years old, do not believe in the Bible. They think they're looking scientifically at this data, but they're not. They're looking at it through a worldview that they have created themselves. So different to my worldview.
Absolutely. I noticed in the news just in the last week, there's been news telling four-wheel drivers to stay off a beach in Western Australia because they've found all these, mega old tree stumps on a beach that have just turned up. They say that, because of all these, massive swells that have been pushing in, they've torn the beach away and they're showing what the Earth looked like thousands of years ago before giant floods. But they have done some studies into how old this is using carbon dating. It only goes back thousands of years.
Yeah, those logs, by the way, and those stumps, they're found everywhere. Where I live here in southeast Queensland, there are millions of them.
Okay,
we call them polystrate fossils. There's another big word for you, Mick. Polystrate fossils. But there's a real problem with some of these polystrate fossils. They don't have root systems and they don't have branches. They're simply the tree trunks all standing basically vertical in existing rock. And that's a real problem for scientists as to where did the roots go? Where did the branches go? Why are the tree trunks around in what we call these polystrate fossils?
Why are they vertical?
Good question. We didn't know for a long time, but would you believe Mount St. Helens helped us to understand that?
Okay.
When Mount St. Helens blew, what it did was it just smashed thousands, tens of thousands of trees, just cut them off at the base with that explosion. And burnt the tops off and so on. So what happened was thousands of logs just simply went down the river with all the rainfall as well and went into a massive lake. And they all floated there like a log mat, if you like, on the water, on top of the water. But when they went to sink, they didn't just go to the bottom. They all actually turned upright and began bobbing like tree trunks upright in the water.
One end gets waterlogged and heavier first.
And so what happens is the whole thing, then they all stood up vertically and then they went down, slowly sank down and got stuck in the mud underneath at the bottom of the lake, which is fascinating. And so now we know that it's a violent event that does this, an incredibly violent event. And when you talk about millions of these tree trunks under parts of southeast Queensland and like that, you're talking about incredible event. Wow. You're not talking about a local event. So, these tree trunks are always a really good indicator to us because they're found everywhere. They've got this unusual feature that they've got no roots. In other words, they didn't grow there. They didn't grow there. Yeah. They were transported there during a catastrophic flood event. Wow.
And, obviously these flood events were at very, very different times to the Carnian Pluvial episode being what they're saying millions of years ago.
Yes, that's right. And I think this is my view, and I'm putting it that way as a view because, let's be blunt, none of us was there. None of us saw it. And so we have to use the existing data that we have to try and interpret it, and so on. But I'm going to argue that the very data that they used to say there was this incredible event 232 million years ago is the same data I used to say there was an incredible event 4,500 years ago.
Yeah.
Just a massive, massive pluvial or fluvial or whatever you want to call it. But they're only using, by the way, the geologic data. I think if you go wider, as I have, and look at fossil data, biochemical data and so on, you'll see the argument swings heavily in favour of the Noah's global flood, not of a flood 230 million years ago, or rather a wet period. Let's use their terminology. It was a wet period of intensity.
Yeah, okay, which went for a very long time. Look, we're going to go into a little bit of a break right now. If you have any questions for Dr. Ron Neller, please send them through to our text line. That is 0401 949 949. That is a text number 0401 949 949. You are on 94.9. It is 4:30. That was Lauren Daigle with Still Rolling Stones. You're on 94.9. It is 20 minutes to 5. And we have Dr. Ron Neller on the line from Creation Ministries International. He is a super smart flood man. He was an associate professor in pluvial geomorphology. I love saying that. He knows all about the flood and what happened. And I've been asking him questions today about the Carnian Pluvial episode, which is what, some people are trying to replace the flood with. And basically what they're saying is it was a different flood. It wasn't the flood that you're talking about. It's the flood we're talking about. Yeah, and of course they talk about this massive extinction event that happened during this Carnian Pluvial episode. Is that correct, Dr. Ron?
Yes, Mick, it is. What they argue is that there was an incredible volcanic period. Volcanoes were erupting everywhere. What they were doing then was releasing greenhouse gases. And they say then that led to the world being warmed up, and they then say what was evident then was lots of plants died, many sea creatures vanished, and at this period was also a remarkable period, they said, because it was ideal for dinosaurs. And it's in that Triassic period that dinosaurs began to emerge, because it was so wet, so warm, so lovely. It was the Triassic. So they claim a lot of events happened at that time. By the way, that's where I think the movie Jurassic Park got it wrong. It was actually Triassic Park, but I don't think Hollywood liked that term. It's a funny thing. Dinosaurs were well around before Jurassic. They were in the Triassic. But yes, look, those events. We, as a scientist who studied for 35 years, these same features. To me, it highlighted a global flood, because that's what we argue in Creation Ministries. There was volcanoes. We've done this based on the Bible. There were volcanoes. There was an incredible flood event. Yes, the plants died. Yes, the sea creatures were fossilized and so on. And so, yeah, to me, it's just an interesting. Let me just put an interesting argument that's being put forward. Let me go one step back. Back in the 1980s and the 70s, nobody argued that there was a flood in the academic world. Mm-hmm. Nobody accepted that. But the evidence since then has been so strong, and I've mentioned this before. But when the evidence becomes strong, and you're an academic, and it points to the Bible, invariably, if you don't believe in it, you are going to try and come up with another idea, another theory, another hypothesis. And that's exactly what's happened here. But the very same events align with the flood. And yeah. I just don't see the purpose of coming up with these incredible theories when Scripture already says this happened.
Yeah.
That we have to take it back.
You mentioned the extinction event that they talk about isn't necessarily the way they believe it happened, or you believe it's different.
Well, I would say that the extinction event was it's a global, and it involves everything that wasn't on the ark, actually.
So not just the dinosaurs.
No, not just no. So if you have a global flood occurring, the tearing apart of the land and the release of all the sediment that's needed to bury animals to create fossils only occurs in the beginning of a flood. That's when you get most sediment. Mm-hmm. So what's it going to cover first of all as the flood waters rise? It's going to be the marine creatures. That's why we have 99% of all our fossils are marine.
Yep.
By the time the flood's now starting to rise over the land, any creature with mobility is going to run away from it.
Yes. In
which case there becomes far less fossils. So the actual sequence of fossils from deep down, starting with those that could not escape, all those little things clinging to the ocean floor, then the fish, then the next above that you see coastal, and then you see dinosaurs. But that's not an evolutionary sequence. That's a death sequence. That's the ability of these creatures to move and get away. That's why you find far less mammals, because we had the ability to get away. And by the time we did get drowned, let's say, and people were drowned and animals were drowned, basically much of the sediment had already been deposited.
Yeah.
And was already creating fossils. So, to me, it's all occurred at the same time. It's a straightforward death sequence.
Yep.
In a short period of time, not multiple events. They often argue there was a death sequence here, then another death sequence there, and then the dinosaurs died here. But that's based, it's all a hierarchy, from the bottom up in the rocks. But that's exactly the same as a deposition model, of putting all the sediments down at once. So I think it's just a different way of looking at it.
And Dr. Ron, obviously you're saying this quite a lot of what they're talking about in their model here is kind of correct. It's just the ages, the times, the years that are all wrong. They actually all fit the biblical account. Well, I've just had a question come through from one of our listeners who said, I've just opened my 130-year-old family Bible, and throughout the Bible it has a timeline starting with Genesis 1:1 BC 4004. Is that fairly accurate?
From a creation ministries and from a personal point of view, and having done a lot of study of, I'm not a Hebrew expert, but studying all of that and so on, I agree with that listener's comments, that the flood occurred about 4,500 years ago, which was 1,500 years ago, and we base that on the genealogy, by the way, from the beginning, from Adam onwards. You're looking at 1,500 years before it's Noah's turn, and then that occurred 4,500 years ago. That genealogy is exceptionally accurate.
Yep.
It was extremely good. So I can't see, when I then look at the physical world, when I look at the nature of everything from cliffs to rocks to floodplains to sedimentation to fossils, I see youthfulness in them, not millions of years.
Yes.
And so I'm using both scientific evidence and scriptural evidence. I think the Bible's very clear in pointing out, as that listener has said, the Bible's made it very clear that the book of Genesis is historical and truthful.
Yes, absolutely. Wow. Well, it's we've come to the end of another week. And Dr. Ron Neller, I love listening to what you've got to say, particularly when it comes to the flood, because you've studied it. You've been an associate professor in this stuff. You know what it looks like out there. You've literally dug in the ground and studied everything about the flood. As I said right at the start, when you became a Christian, it all fell into place for you, and now you're helping it fall into place for us. And I thank you so much for spending the time with us today. And I've got to say, I look forward to our next time together.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Mick. Much appreciated.
It is 12 minutes to 5. You're on 94.9. Matthew Parker and Xander Sallo's up next with Ebb and Flow. Good afternoon.